The RTX 5080, which we're taking a look at today, is the successor to the RTX 4080 Super, comes in at $999 USD and features GDDR7, which is much faster VRAM than the predecessor has. Now, we'll get straight into the gaming benchmarks and we'll talk about the value proposition a little bit later because it's important to paint those pictures with all the numbers to see how much value we're actually getting. And here's where we'll start off with Cyberpunk 2077, and at 1440p, here's where we can see we're getting roughly a 20% gain with the FPS in raw rasterization terms, and then stepping things up to 4K, we're going for roughly a 27% gain here. So nothing to laugh at with the same price point card of the 5080 over the 4080 already, so a pretty solid uplift in performance. Moving over to Dragon Age Veilguard, here's where we've got an uplift from 96 average FPS to 122, so this is roughly a 27% increase at 1440p, and then going to 4K, we see roughly a same increase of 27% going from 65 to 88. Then move on to Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. Here is at 1440p, we can see we've got here an uplift from 124 average FPS all the way up to 147, so roughly a 20% gain. Going to 4K, we've also got a 68 versus 83, but back to the 1440p numbers quickly, that RTX 5090 is getting CPU bound with the 9800X3D, currently the best gaming CPU you can get off the shelves. But the 5080 at least doesn't really incur that bottleneck at this resolution, so that's kind of good to see for high refresh rate 1440p gamers. But also, if we're looking at the 4K results, we do get a little bit more performance there versus the 1440p results. And this is kind of true with Cyberpunk 2077 as well. But moving on to Final Fantasy 16, this is where we don't see as big as a gap with a 14% increase in FPS at 1440p. And then we go up to 4K, we get roughly a 16% increase in FPS. So this title doesn't show much of a gain. And then if we move over to Marvel Rivals, this is actually the worst title for an FPS increase with the 5080 versus the 4080 Super, especially at 1440p, where we only saw roughly a 6% gain in performance. And then going up to 4K, we only see roughly an 11% performance increase here. So Marvel Rivals, at least when we're looking at the raw performance figures like we are now, doesn't show much of a gain at all. Then move over to Fortnite. Here's where we're back to that 20% trend, at least at 1440p, 131 average FPS versus 158. Now this was kind of surprising because we're right on the heels of the RTX 4090 at 1440p. And this is one thing about the 5080 that I'm actually liking so far, is that it's coming very close to the 4090, more so than it is to the 4080 Super, which does make it a lot better of a value proposition when we look at $1,000 versus $1,600, for instance. And then stepping things up to 4K, however, we then see a 22% increase in performance. Now moving on to Riftbreaker, here's where the FPS is so high in this game, I decided to turn on ray tracing as well, and the FPS is still incredibly high. Now this is on DirectX 12, and we see here we've got an uplift from 255 average FPS all the way up to 315. with a nice solid increase of 23%. Now moving up to 4K, we can see the results are even better, where we go from 127 average FPS all the way up to 166. So this is a 31% increase in raw performance, which is actually quite an impressive showing. I think this is the best result for these numbers here today when we're just looking at a pure performance gain. Then move on to the next game here, Black Myth Wukong. We've got here roughly a 15% increase at 1440p, 82 versus 94. And then at 4K, we're looking at roughly a 17% increase. So with those raw performance numbers, if that's all you're looking for out of a graphics card, you're actually going to get a decent uplift in performance. At least in my value charts here, we're getting a 22% increase in the raw value because the price here is the same, being $999 USD. So actually kind of a decent value uplift there, especially versus the 4090 versus 5090 scenario, where we only got really a value increase of roughly 6%. So at least we're getting over a 20% value increase for gaming if you're just into the raw performance numbers. Then let's move on now to ray tracing. If you want to turn this technology on, here's where you'll get a similar uplift in performance as we saw with the raw rasterization benchmarks. So with Cyberpunk, we saw roughly a 25% increase, and then moving on to Dragon Age Veilguard, we saw here roughly a 20% increase with the raw ray tracing numbers. Then the next game we tested for ray tracing was Black Myth Wukong, and here's where we got roughly a 17% increase in the raw ray tracing figures. Though as we saw with Cyberpunk and Black Myth Wukong especially, these were games where the 5080 is getting like around 20 average FPS, which is just not going to be playable if you want to play at 4K with ray tracing on. And here's where Nvidia has made a big push this generation with the RTX 5000 with multi-frame generation. And what this is going to do is essentially in between the frames, it's going to insert 3 or 4 frames. You can actually choose the setting. And playing on this, I was actually very impressed, especially with Cyberpunk and also Dragon Age the Veilguard. Now with Black Myth Wukong, it's currently only got DLSS support, so that's just your regular frame generation, inserting a frame when it can. So you can see here, you're not getting much of an uplift with the RTX 5080 over the 4080 Super in this particular title. But if we move over to Cyberpunk, we can then get some pretty big gains if you want to turn on this technology. Now, it does add a little bit of input lag, just like DLSS 3, but for me personally, playing on a game that's more role-playing focused, rather than competitive multiplayer, I would actually prefer to keep this on. It did give out a really nice experience, and I thought it was actually quite a lot more polished this time around than when Nvidia first released DLSS 3. So the DLSS 4 is actually working really well out of the gate, especially when you combine it with things like the new transformer model that they released. And if you're like me and you like to turn off ray tracing, you can experiment with things like DLAA and get an absolutely gorgeous picture at 4K for what I think it was intended for. And that's just single player role-playing situations. If you're playing online multiplayer competitive, me personally, I wouldn't have this on. I want the lowest input latency possible. I want to get competitive, and so I'm actually going to lower the settings in that particular game, where then the graphics card is just going to be absolutely fine and not having a stressful time. So MFG is currently actually working really well, but if we look at a game like Dragon Age the Veilguard, I thought this game at 4K actually looked really bad, especially when we turn it on the default ultra settings. And I talked about this in my RTX 5090 review, where I just decided to turn on DLAA with MFG and then also super sample the game at 150% screen res down to 4K. And then what this produced was just such a sharper image that just looked way better than the original 4K ultra settings. So ultimately with DLSS4, it's another option that's there and can definitely give you a good uplift for smoothness if that's what you're looking for with really hard to run games. Though stepping things back to the ray tracing, and we'll pull up the value chart that we've made here, just across the titles we tested, we're getting roughly a 23% boost in raw value at the same 999 USD price point. Now also, if we wanted to talk about inflation, in the meantime, in the last year, since the 4080 Super has been released, yeah, you can probably say it's roughly 26% better value at its current standpoint. However, let's go over the last point in today's review, and this is the undervolting experience, because in the last 5090 review that we did, you guys were actually loving the undervolting experience. Now, outside of this review, I am going to talk about undervolting, and I'm going to make a dedicated video going much more in depth into undervolting, the different styles of undervolting, as well as what you can expect to get in terms of performance at much more different levels than what I'm showing in today's review. It's just that you guys really enjoy this to see how much of a power drop you can get. And here's where with the power consumption numbers, out of the box, they're actually pretty good, and they're beating that of the 4080 Super in terms of efficiency when we look at the performance gains you're getting. And this was with a Zotac 4080 Super. This was the model that we were testing with in today's video. It was a custom model, so it may use a slight bit more amount of power, but even then, it's not going to make much of a difference. The 4080 Super isn't as efficient as the 5080 out of the box, but here's where we can undervolt the 5080 and we can just get really nice drops. Not as significant as the 5090 was, but that was going way up near 600 watts. But we can still drop things down, especially when we look at the level, which is my favorite, the 2.5 gigahertz level. We can get the power consumption down roughly 100 watts. If you want to go down to 2.3 gigahertz, you can drop it down roughly 120 watts direct draw. And then, of course, the 2.7 gigahertz undervolt. This is giving you very similar performance to the 5080 out of the box, but you're then getting a power drop. And this is a really good thing for mini ITX users. And here's where with the 5080, when you undervolt it, you are going to bring the temperatures down of the card, which is going to be great for mini RTX users. And especially in the case of the RTX 5080, it's going to be actually a really important thing because there's going to be models outside of the Founders Edition that will support the SFF format or small form factor format, meaning that there's going to be models available that you can buy that you can fit into a mini RTX rig outside of the Founders card. Unlike the 5090, where there's only the Founders Edition model that is a small form factor ready design, the 5080 actually has partner cards that will be available and at a reasonable price that will fit in small form factor. Because at this stage, it's looking like more and more like the Founders Edition models are going to be pretty much unobtainium, that rare material that you guys know. And in Australia, they're just not going to exist. That's what I'm told with the 5090 Founders and now the 5080 Founders. You just won't be able to get these models in Australia because they're not going to ship them to us. So at least with the 5080, we're able to get small form factor editions that will hit the market and that will please people for mini RTX users. Though there's still one more round of benchmarks that we're going to do here, because coupling this in with the power consumption, this may make me switch from the 5090 to the 5080 because I'm using small form factor myself, mini RTX build. And this is with the Adobe Premiere Pro results. And here's where I got virtually the same final render, as well as when I was just going through the timeline and just testing out the graphics card itself. It was pretty much an identical experience in Premiere Pro as the 5090. In other words, if you're video editing heavily, you're going to love the 5080, especially because it's half the price of the 5090. And it's also got the same two decoders. The 5080 still carries two of those as well, and they're the latest generation. So I found with the higher clock speeds on both the GDDR7 and also the higher clock speeds on the core itself, this was just smoking through Adobe Premiere Pro. And so you're not going to be disappointed if you want to get this card for video editing, but also in some of the other productivity benchmarks like V-Ray, the results were kind of a little bit weird, coming very close to that of 4080 Super, and also in the case of the CUDA benchmark, that was falling significantly behind, just like the 5090 was. I did ask NVIDIA about this, and they said they're going to patch this in driver updates. Expect that to be fixed very soon. And if we look at the next benchmark, Geekbench 6, we can see here the OpenCL is doing pretty much the same as the RTX 4080 Super. So depending on your particular use case scenario, whether it's gaming or whether it's productivity, you can see here that the 4080 Super and the 5080 can come very close, but then in other certain instances like Premiere Pro, there can actually be quite a significant gap. So just look at the particular benchmarks that you want to look at, especially if you've got maybe a 4080 Super at the moment and you're thinking about changing. I would definitely look at the benchmarks that relate to what you do and see if it's actually worth your time and money. And this is going to tie in perfectly now with the conclusion, because when we look at the value charts, the 5080 I think is going to be much better of a value proposition than the 5090 is. And also there's some other factors that I'm going to talk about with the conclusion here, because what I'm ultimately looking at with the $1,000 USD price point is something that I can recommend. This one's actually pretty solid, and it's going to be a blanket recommendation for people around the $1,000 price point. And the reason I think this is because we're not only getting that chunk of over 20% uplift in both ray tracing and raw raster, but also with the 5080, I think it's going to be much more in stock than the 5090 will be. And the reason for this is because the 4090, at least in Australia here, I don't know what it's like in other countries because I haven't really experienced so much, but over the last, especially 6 months, I've just seen 4090s constantly come in and out of stock, and they've usually been elevated prices for these GPUs. As opposed to the 4080 Super, they've just been consistently in stock at good prices. And even then, on like Black Friday, for instance, I got a really good deal on a 4080 Super for under MSRP, and that's with the 10% tax that we pay in Australia. So I think the 5080 is going to be much more realistic in terms of being able to be attained at a decent price than the 5090 will be. And it's also, in my opinion, probably one of the much better value buys this time around with the 5000 series, as the 4090, when we look at that in contrast within the 4000 series, especially out of the gate versus the 4080, the vanilla, at $1,200 USD when that launched, the 4090 was looking like a much better value proposition, right? So this time around, the 5080 at $1,000, it's actually making a lot more sense than even a 5090 or a 4090 at their current price points. So this card for me personally is not just a welcome upgrade in the raw value, but it's also a welcome upgrade in the other features that it carries too, like those two decoders now, and then having the new generation of decoders, and also being more efficient than the 4080 Super, as well as having more options this time around from the get-go for small form factor support. So overall, with the RTX 5080, I think it's a solid win here from NVIDIA, especially since the node change from the 4000 to the 5000 series is very minimal. It's virtually the same node that they're using, yet you're still getting quite a significant performance boost this time around with that 5080 over the RTX 4080 Super. And of course, you're getting the 2x decoders, you're getting the new generation of those, you're getting better encoders, you're getting multi-frame generation support. So there's actually a few things that are pretty good with this card. There's also Reflex 2 that's coming as well. I've got to test that properly. I will be making a dedicated video to that, but that'll be dropping for the RTX 4000 series cards as well in due time. Then the RTX 5080 also carries DisplayPort 2.1, giving you much bigger bandwidth than that of the RTX 4000 series. You've also got the HDMI 2.1, of course, but also the RTX 4000 series did carry HDMI 2.1, but the DisplayPort 2.1 is a nice welcome upgrade here, and you're still using the same 12-volt high-power connector point, and you also do get an adapter included. This is an upgraded braided edition, this time around at least with the Founders Edition. And speaking of the Founders Edition, the temperatures are really good with the 5080, and this is in Furmark, keep in mind, so things do get pretty hot here, and it's in a 25°C ambient environment here. It is summer in Australia. However, with the 5080, it's also about 150 grams lighter than the 5090, even though the 5080 cooler has the same 2-slot design. It's got the same dimensions, measuring up to 304 mil. Anyhow, guys, hope you enjoyed today's review with the RTX 5080, and my gut instinct said that the 5080 and the 5070 Ti are going to be the best value solutions out of the RTX 5000 series lineup this time around, and it's looking like this 5080 is definitely punching really close to that 4090. And even though it's got 8 GB less of VRAM, it's still got faster VRAM. I mean, 16 GB is also a lot of VRAM. I haven't come anywhere near maxing that, at least with realistic settings in games. So RTX 5080 gets the thumbs up from Tech Yes. And with that aside, if you guys have stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that like button and also hit that sub button if you want to see the content as soon as it drops. And also, if you have any questions or comments about today's review, be sure to drop them down below. And with that aside, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.